In the winter of 1983, Child Protective Services arrived at a farm in rural Pennsylvania. What they found in that house would challenge everything we thought we knew about isolation, memory, and the human mind. The children spoke fluently. They communicated with each other constantly, but the language coming out of their mouths had been dead for 200 years. This is the story the county tried to bury. This is the story of Oldridge Farm. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Oldridge family had lived on that property since 1798. 6 generations, same bloodline, same 240 acres of Pennsylvania timber and stone. By 1983, the family had dwindled to just a handful of people living in the original farmhouse, a structure that predated the Civil War and had never been modernized. No electricity after 1976. No running water after 1979. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles through dense forest. The county had almost forgotten the old ridges existed, but someone made a call. On January 14th, 1983, an anonymous tip came into the county welfare office. The caller claimed there were children living in conditions unfit for animals. The caller also said something else, something the intake worker wrote down but didn't quite believe. The children, the caller said, didn't speak English. They spoke something else, something old. When the social workers arrived 3 days later, they brought a sheriff's deputy. Protocol. The dirt road leading to the farm hadn't been plowed in years. They had to walk the last mile and a half. The farmhouse stood at the end of a clearing, its windows dark, its shutters hanging crooked. Smoke came from the chimney. Someone was home. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Then they heard it. Voices, children's voices, but the words were wrong. The rhythm was wrong. One of the social workers, a woman named Patricia Dunn, would later say it sounded like singing, like a chant, like something from a church she'd never been to. The deputy forced the door. Inside they found 7 children, ages 3 to 14, all dressed in clothing that looked handmade, rough wool, hand-stitched cotton. The youngest child was barefoot despite the cold. The oldest, a boy named Nathaniel, stood in front of the others like a shield. And when Patricia Dunn asked him his name, he answered, but not in English. She didn't understand a single word. The children were removed from the home that same day. Their mother, a woman named Mary Oldridge, did not resist. She watched from the doorway as they were led to the vehicles, her face expressionless, her hands folded in front of her like she was attending a funeral. She was 41 years old, but looked 60. Her husband Thomas Oldridge was not present. The deputy asked where he was. Mary said nothing. They would later find his body in the barn. He had been dead for 6 weeks. The children were taken to County General Hospital in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Standard procedure, medical exams, psychological evaluations. But the staff immediately noticed something deeply wrong. The children would not respond to English. Not a word, not a gesture. They huddled together in the examination room, whispering to each other in that same strange language. Nurses tried to separate them for individual exams. The children screamed, not in panic, in fury, in a language no one could identify. Dr. Raymond Keller was the pediatrician on duty. He had worked in the county for 18 years. He had seen neglect. He had seen abuse, but he had never seen this. He recorded the children speaking and sent the tape to a colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, a linguist, someone who might be able to tell him what he was hearing. The response came back 3 days later. The language was a dialect of early modern English, specifically a form spoken in rural England and parts of colonial America during the late 1700s. It had characteristics of Scots-Irish inflection mixed with archaic Anglican religious terminology. In other words, the children were speaking the way their ancestors had spoken 100 years ago, and they spoke it fluently, natively, as if it was the only language they had ever known. Doctor? Keller asked the obvious question, how the linguist, Dr. Aaron Pritchard, drove out to Millbrook himself. He spent 2 hours with the children. He spoke to them in modern English. They stared at him like he was speaking gibberish. He tried German, French, nothing. Then he tried something else. He read aloud from a historical document, a land deed from 1792, written in the formal English of that era. The oldest boy, Nathaniel, tilted his head. He spoke. Dr. Pritchard understood him. Nathaniel had asked if Dr. Pritchard was a magistrate. The investigation into the Oldridge family began immediately. What they uncovered was not just neglect. It was something far more deliberate. Something that had been passed down generation after generation like a family disease. The Oldridges had intentionally isolated themselves for over a century. No public schooling, no outside contact, no marriages outside the family. County records showed that Mary Oldridge had been born Mary Oldridge. Her mother had been an Oldridge. Her grandmother had been an Aldridge. The family tree didn't branch. It looped back on itself over and over. The genetic consequences were visible in the children. 3 of them had minor physical deformities. 2 had hearing problems, but their minds were sharp. Too sharp. They had been taught rigorously, just not in any way the modern world would recognize. When investigators searched the farmhouse, they found the library, an entire room filled with books, hundreds of them, but none published after 1820. Bibles from the 1700s, agricultural manuals from the early 1800s, religious texts, medical guides that recommended bloodletting and mercury treatments, and journals, dozens of handwritten journals. The oldest dated back to 1803. The journals revealed the family's philosophy, their mission. It had started with the first American Oldridge, a man named Jeremiah. He had come to Pennsylvania in 1796, fleeing what he called the corruption of the new century. He believed the modern world was diseased, that progress was a lie, that the only way to preserve the soul was to preserve the past. So he created a sanctuary, a place where time would stop, where his descendants would live exactly as he lived, speak exactly as he spoke, believe exactly as he believed, and it worked. For 6 generations, the Oldridges had maintained this bubble. They taught their children from the old books. They spoke only the old language. They preserved the old ways of farming, cooking, building, praying. The outside world changed. Wars happened. Technology exploded. Culture shifted. But inside that farmhouse, it was still 1798. The children had never seen a television. They had never heard a radio. They didn't know what a car was. When a nurse showed one of the younger girls a photograph, the child screamed and called it witchcraft. Dr. Pritchard spent weeks with the children trying to bridge the gap. He learned their language. He translated for the social workers. And slowly the children began to trust him. Slowly they began to tell him what life had been like on the farm. What he heard made him stop sleeping. The children described a world built entirely on fear. Fear of the outside. Fear of contamination. Fear of God's wrath. They had been taught that beyond the farm lay a fallen world, a place of demons and sickness and sin. Thomas Oldridge, their father, had told them that if they ever left the property, their souls would rot, that the air itself beyond the tree line was poisonous, that strangers spoke the language of the devil. They believed him. The children had never left the farm, not once. The oldest, Nathaniel, had been born in that house 14 years earlier and had never walked beyond the clearing. Their education consisted of Bible recitation, agricultural labor, and the memorization of family texts. They could recite entire chapters of scripture in archaic English. They could butcher a pig and tan a hide, but they could not read a modern sentence. They could not understand a calendar when Dr. Pritchard told them the year was 1983. They did not comprehend the number. Discipline had been absolute. The journals described a system of punishment passed down through generations. Disobedience was met with isolation. A child who questioned the family teachings would be locked in the root cellar for days. A child who attempted to leave the property, even to explore the woods, would be tied to a post in the barn and left there overnight. The journals called this correction. They called it love. But the most disturbing discovery came from the youngest children. The 3-year-old girl named Abigail had never spoken to an adult outside the family. She had never been held by anyone but her mother and siblings when a nurse tried to comfort her. Abigail bit her hard, drew blood. Then she whispered something in that ancient language. Dr. Pritchard translated it later. She had called the nurse a demon. The psychologists brought in to evaluate the children struggled to find a framework. This was not simple abuse. This was cultural isolation so complete that the children's entire understanding of reality had been shaped by a world from 2 centuries ago. They feared technology. They feared modern people. They believed genuinely that the world beyond the farm was hell itself. One of the evaluators, Dr. Linda Vasquez, wrote in her report that deprogramming these children might be impossible, that their minds had been so thoroughly shaped by the family's delusion that reintegration into modern society could cause complete psychological collapse. The state disagreed. The children were placed into foster care, separated, scattered across 3 counties. The theory was that separation would force adaptation, that without each other, they would have no choice but to learn English to join the modern world. It was a catastrophic mistake. Within 2 months, 3 of the children had attempted suicide. The youngest boy, only 5 years old, tried to hang himself with a bed sheet. A foster parent found him in time. He never spoke again, not in any language. The 10-year-old girl, Ruth, stopped eating. She would sit in the corner of her foster home, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers in that dead language until her voice gave out. She was hospitalized for malnutrition within 6 weeks. Nathaniel, the oldest, became violent. He attacked his foster father with a kitchen knife, screaming words no one could understand. He was placed in a juvenile psychiatric facility. The doctors tried everything: therapy, medication, isolation. Nothing worked. He would spend hours staring at the walls, his lips moving silently as if reciting something from memory. When Dr. Pritchard visited him, Nathaniel grabbed his arm and begged him in that ancient English to take him home, to take him back to the farm. Dr. Pritchard asked him why. The boy's answer was chilling. He said they were all going to die out here, that God could not find them in this world, that the family had broken and now the curse would come. The county scrambled to reverse course. By late 1983, the decision was made to reunite the children, to place them together in a group home with staff trained in trauma care. Dr. Pritchard was brought on as a consultant. He insisted the children needed continuity, familiarity. They needed to be allowed to speak their language while slowly, carefully being introduced to the modern world. But the damage had been done when the children were finally brought back together in November of 1983. They were different, quieter, hollowed out. They clung to each other, but the light in their eyes had dimmed. The youngest, Abigail, had stopped speaking entirely. Ruth had developed a nervous tic, pulling out her own hair in clumps. Nathaniel sat apart from the others, his face blank, his hands folded in his lap exactly the way his mother's had been the day they were taken. The staff tried to create a bridge. They hired a tutor who worked with Dr. Pritchard to teach the children modern English while respecting their native tongue. Progress was slow, painful. Some of the children learned basic phrases. Others refused. The trauma of separation had taught them that the outside world was exactly what their father had said it was. A place of cruelty, a place of demons. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Mary Oldridge was never charged with a crime. The county attorney reviewed the case and determined that while the conditions were abusive by modern standards, Mary herself had been a victim. She had been born into the same system. Raised in the same isolation, she knew nothing else. Charging her, they decided, would be like charging someone for being born into a cult. She was released after a psychiatric evaluation and vanished. Some say she returned to the farm. Others say she walked into the woods and never came back. No one knows for certain. The farm itself was seized by the county for unpaid taxes. In 1984, they attempted to auction it off. No one bid. The property had a reputation by then. The locals called it cursed. There were stories. People claimed to hear children's voices in those woods at night, singing in a language that didn't belong to this century. Hikers reported finding strange symbols carved into trees near the property line. Cross's words in old script. Warnings. The farmhouse burned down in 1987. The fire department listed it as accidental. But there was no electricity on the property. No gas lines. Nothing that could have sparked a blaze. The fire started in the library, the room with all the journals. By the time firefighters arrived, there was nothing left but ash and stone. Every book, every journal, every piece of evidence that explained how the Oldridge family had maintained their isolation for so long gone. Dr. Pritchard kept copies of some of the journals. He spent years studying them, trying to understand the psychology behind what had happened. He published a paper in 1989 titled Temporal Isolation and Linguistic Preservation in Extremist Family Systems. It was largely ignored by the academic community. Too disturbing, too strange. But in that paper, he made an argument that still haunts anyone who reads it. He argued that the Oldridge children were not mentally ill. They were not damaged by some genetic defect or neurological disorder. They were perfectly sane. Their minds had simply been shaped by a reality that no longer existed. And in removing them from that reality, in forcing them into a world they had been taught to fear, the state had done something worse than neglect. It had committed a kind of murder, not of their bodies, but of their souls. By 1990, most of the Oldridge children had been institutionalized. The trauma of integration had been too much. Ruth died in a psychiatric hospital in 1992. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but she was only 19 years old. Nathaniel disappeared from state records in 1994. Some say he ran away. Others believe he found his way back to those woods, back to the only home his mind could accept. Only 2 of the children successfully adapted, a boy named Samuel and a girl named Esther. They learned English. They attended school. They built lives in the modern world, but neither of them ever spoke about the farm. Not to therapists, not to friends, not to anyone. Dr. Pritchard tried to contact them in the early 2000s. Both refused to meet with him. The silence, he said, was louder than anything they could have told him. The Oldridge case was quietly sealed by the county in 1995. The official reason was to protect the privacy of the surviving children. But those who worked on the case believed it was something else. Embarrassment. Shame. The state had taken children from a bad situation and made it worse. They had separated siblings who depended on each other for survival. They had forced a language and a world onto minds that could not accept it. And children had died because of it. Dr. Pritchard continued his research until his death in 2009. In his final years, he became obsessed with a single question. Were the Oldridge children better off? If the state had never intervened, if the children had been left on that farm, would they have lived longer, happier? He could never answer it. But in his private notes found after his death, he wrote something that still chills anyone who reads it. He wrote that the Oldridge children were the last speakers of a dead language. That when they died, something that had survived for 200 years died with them. A way of thinking, a way of seeing the world, and maybe, he wrote, that was not progress. Maybe that was extinction. In 2016, a journalist named Michael Crane tried to track down the surviving Oldridge children. He found Samuel living in Ohio under a different name. Samuel agreed to meet, but only once. They sat in a diner for 20 minutes. Michael asked him about the farm, about his childhood, about the language. Samuel stared at him for a long time. Then he said something in perfect modern English. He said, "We were happy there. We didn't know we were supposed to be saved." Then he stood up and walked out. Michael never saw him again. Esther was harder to find. She had married, changed her name twice, built a life far away from Pennsylvania. When Michael finally tracked her down, she refused to speak to him. But she sent him a letter, 1 page, handwritten. It said that the farm was not evil, that her father was not a monster, that the world had misunderstood what they were. She said the family had been trying to preserve something sacred, something the modern world had lost. And in destroying it, in scattering them, the state had committed the real crime. The letter ended with a single sentence written not in English, but in that old language, the language of her childhood. Michael had it translated. It said, "We are the last, and when we are gone, no one will remember how to speak to God the way we did." The Oldridge Farm still stands as an empty plot in rural Pennsylvania. The foundation of the old house is still there, hidden beneath weeds and saplings. Locals avoid it. There are no tours, no historical markers. The county would prefer the whole story be forgotten. But every few years, someone posts on a local forum. They were hiking near the old property. They heard something. Voices, children's voices singing in a language they didn't recognize. No one ever investigates. The Oldridge children spoke a language no one had heard for 200 years. And now most of them are gone. The language is dead again. The family is scattered or buried. But the question remains, the question Dr. Pritchard could never answer. The question that keeps people awake at night when they hear this story. Were they rescued or were they destroyed? You decide.